Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me this morning. We are looking at funding opportunities in the justice sector, focusing primarily on policing and Office of Police and Crime Commissioners. And this has been dedicated to the Durham Office of Police and Crime Commissioner. But a lot of what we talk about today will be relevant regardless of whether it's a police force, a police and crime commissioner, or actually in any event, probably most public sector contracting authorities. So welcome everyone. We have got quite a number of people signed up for this morning. So we've got about 90 minutes laid out, but we might not need all of that 90 minutes. I know everyone is super busy. So I've carved out some time for questions at the end, but you can also ask questions throughout the webinar today. The chat functionality in Zoom is enabled, or you can use the Q&A functionality as well. If you are using chat, I think it gives you options of who can see that chat, everyone or hosts and panelists. So if you are using chat, just make sure that you are addressing it to whoever you want to see it. If you'd like to say hi, introduce yourself on the chat, please feel free to do so, but don't feel like you have to. Just some housekeeping stuff, and then I'll introduce myself. The session is being recorded today, and a copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck that I'm using today will be sent out to all registered attendees. So again, feel free to take any notes as you want to throughout the session. But everything that you see today, and that there are a few live links to different things as well. They will all be click-through links when they come out. So you will get everything that you see and hear today. But my name is Gillian Askew. I'm one of 3 co-founders and directors of a social enterprise called Go for Growth. I'm a procurement professional by trade. So this year is my 30th anniversary in procurement, 18 years in private sector and 12 years in public sector. So my job has typically been to put procurements out into the marketplace on behalf of the public and private sectors. But I'm also a long-standing micro business owner, and I currently run a couple of social enterprises working for the public sector. And I say that only just to share that I've walked a mile in both pairs of shoes. So I understand the challenges that our procurement colleagues face, especially under regulated procurement. But I also understand the challenges and the barriers that are at play for smaller organisations and the voluntary sector when we're seeking to start out or grow in the public sector. So Go for Growth, we are all about supporting the marketplace, and all of the support that we offer, we are funded through public sector contracting authority clients who choose to invest in the programme. So all of the support that we offer to the marketplace is offered free of charge at point of use. So if you do want to, we're cantering through quite a lot this morning. So if you do want to chat with Go for Growth, or myself individually outside of today's webinar, please do feel free to do so. Contact details will be on the last slide. So, please do feel free to get in touch. We're running at a little bit of a high level today. So if you want to grab into any details, do just to get in touch. I'll keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A as we go through. So do feel free to pop anything in as we go. But as I've said, I have carved out some time for questions at the back end if we need it. So what we're going to look at today, I've done introductions. We're going to just have a quick delve into the grants processes. And I've got a couple of links of where you can find more information about grants, specifically in Durham, but then more broadly as well. I'll then start to bring to life the public sector contracts process a little bit in terms of how does that differ from the grant funding process, and what sort of tools do you need to have in your toolkit for both grants and public sector contracts, where you would need to tender through a competitive process for those public sector contracts. And I've also got some information as well on where you can find opportunities for public sector contracts as well. We'll have a quick look at social value and carbon net zero, so two real prominent agenda in the public sector. but they can often be fairly confusing for the provider marketplace. So I'm going to just talk through those two things as well. And then we'll think about what are the pitfalls and key messages. So what are some of the top tips, I guess, that we can give when you're seeking to do business with the public sector. And then I'll leave you with a little bit of information about how you can access the support that's on offer from Go for Growth. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So a little bit more about me. I have worked in sustainable procurement for most of my career. So I've focused on what are the broader impacts that procurement can bring. So I have been dedicated to helping procurement move from price to cost to value. So procuring value and trying to help it not feel like it's the fastest race to the bottom for providers. So not a case of cheaper price wins, that kind of thing. I am a business mentor. I'm also a mentor for procurement professionals. I have worked in the help to grow management, the government funded help to grow management sector as a coach. And I also work with the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, working with procurement organisations through their procurement excellence programme. So I actually assess organisations on their procurement maturity through a diagnostic and excellence programme assessment process. So I've been around for a while. I'm a chartered fellow of the Institute of Procurement and Supply. So hopefully that knowledge will be useful for today and gives you some confidence that the person who's talking to you today has got some, fairly extensive background in this kind of thing. So I don't know if you are familiar with Blue Light Commercial. I am hosting this webinar today, in part at least, on behalf of Durham Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, but also on behalf of Blue Light Commercial. Blue Light Commercial were established in 2020 by the Home Office, and they are in effect owned by all police and crime commissioners. So all 43 forces are members of Blue Light Commercial. And effectively what they are doing is providing commercial support, both nationally, but also at force and OPCC level. So they would typically be looking at opportunities where to put a procurement in place that forces or offices of police and crime commissioners can access and use rather than running their own procurements. Then typically that's the kind of procurement support that they might offer, but they also offer strategic support in commissioning and support for non-commercial activities like social value. And there is a link to the social value action planning tool on this slide if you want to have a click through to it. I am, Blue Light Commercial are a partner of Go for Growth, and so you might see opportunities with Blue Light Commercial as well for opportunities for procurement opportunities out into the marketplace. So please do keep a lookout for Blue Light Commercial as we go. When we're looking through opportunities, you might find some for them as well. So if we move on and start thinking about the grant application process, grant funding. So today we're looking principally at two funding application processes, grant funding and commission services or tendered procurements. So probably about 2.5 years ago, I was part of a roadshow in the city of Bradford with Bradford and District voluntary sector members group. And we were working with local providers on what are the things that you should know and understand about the grant application process. And so I'm replaying a little bit of that here today. So there are some common elements that would sit across both a grant funding process and also a procurement process. But let me start by some of the things that you can see on screen. So, and some of this might sound super obvious, but it's worth considering that whoever's completing the application in your organisation needs to have either a good level of knowledge around the organisation's governance, for example, what it is that you're applying for, the funding proposal itself, any delivery partners that you might be working with, or have access to those resources so that they can get the information together. That's always the case in a procurement as well. When you are writing your quality question answers, excuse me, then that access to all of the relevant information that you need is going to be super important. And in both cases, in either a contract or a grant fund, and again, it sounds very obvious, but making sure that you understand and have read the full funding criteria before you put your application together is really important. Usually for grants, in the same way as contracts, the application process will include some sort of online application. It will be a digital-based application, and you will also be able to attach evidentiary documents to it. So very similar to the contracting process in public sector, your application will be strengthened the more evidence that you can put into the application process. There will be constraints potentially in both processes. So the questions that you're asked, there may be word count limits or page count limits. They will be a maximum rather than a guideline. So in both cases, in a grant funding application and definitely in a commission service or procurement competition, if there is a word or a page count constraint, just follow it. Don't exceed that maximum, and double check and triple check that you haven't exceeded that maximum, because it will be a real cut-off at how many words you're able to submit. One of the key differences, however, between grant funding applications and contracts can often be that you have the ability to discuss your project with funders or facilitators first, or even sometimes during the grant funding application process, especially if you have questions or queries. And how that differs from a contract really is that, and you'll see when I start to break down the contracts process, there is something called clarification questions that you can ask in a contracts process. What you can't do is get into any discussion with the contracting authority that's put that procurement opportunity out. The only mechanism that you have is to ask clarification questions, and it's a time-sensitive process. But in the grant funding application process, there is normally the ability to actually have some discussion about your project with funders or facilitators first, or even potentially during that process. And as it says on screen, every grant will differ in terms of the qualifying criteria. What I've tried to do, however, is pull together some generalizations that might give you some pointers. So generally for a grant funding application, you'll need to be a not-for-profit organisation, although there is more and more grant-based funding for social enterprises now. You might expect to have at least 3 unrelated trustees or directors, or a management committee, for example. Sometimes there might be an expectation that no single director or trustee will have more than 50% control, for example. If you're applying for grant funding on behalf of your organisation and you're not sure where to find information about persons of significant control, so do any of our trustees or directors have more than 50% control of the organisation, you can find that under persons of significant control at Companies House, and charities are obliged to file this every year. Social enterprises are often limited companies by legal structure. And so Go for Growth is a social enterprise. We are a limited company in legal structure, but in our articles of association, we've made our social enterprise commitments of how we'll run, how we'll deal with profit, all of those things. And so if it's a social enterprise that you're acting on behalf of, and you're a limited company in construct, then you will find those persons of significant control still on the Companies House website. Your memorandum and articles of association, your M&Arts, as they are often shortened to, will show how your business is managed. So if anybody wanted to go to Companies House and look at Go for Growth, you will see our commitments to how we'll behave as a social enterprise. We have made it clear in our memorandum and articles how we'll treat any income, any profit, and how we'll make a social contribution as an organisation. And the social impact should be the main focus of the organisation. And that is the case for Go for Growth as a social enterprise. And that will be important in grant funding criteria. In both grants and contracts, your financial standing will be asked about. So for grants, you might be asked for a bank account in the company name. Some funders require 2 individual unrelated signatories. You will need to demonstrate your financial standing, but also for grants, you will almost certainly be asked how you will manage the grant money. So depending on the type of grant, there might be restrictions on what you can use the money for. So you might only be able to use it for capital and not to fund salaries, or you may well be permissible to use it for salary funding, for example. There might also be match funding at play. And if there is match funding, you might well be asked to demonstrate where that match funding is coming from. So the grant might be for 10,000 and you might be expected to also show where you have got another 10,000 to match that grant funding from. In both grants and contracts, you're likely to be asked about core key policies in your organisation. So if you would be working with children or vulnerable groups, for example, it's likely that you would need a safeguarding policy to accompany the grant application. And in terms of top tips for grants, these were actually put together by some grant facilitators at that roadshow series that I talked about. And I thought they were really helpful tips actually for grants. So one of the things that funders talked a lot about was point number 4 in terms of do your research. Often funders say that they get similar applications for grants from organisations locally who actually geographically could be quite close to each other, but who aren't working together or potentially don't even know about each other. So that can be difficult actually for the funder to determine where the funding should go. So when you're putting your funding application together, it could be useful to think about what you're doing that's different. What's the gap that your project would fulfill, especially if that's local? How have you determined what the need is for what you're doing and who else is doing what nearby? And you can sort of help take the funder on that narrative journey, tell the story of what it is you're trying to achieve, why it's important that you achieve it, and who else is doing what that either complements or offsets or is different to what it is that you're trying to secure funding for. Funders will also need to try and consider balance. So, and when I talk about balance in this context, what I mean is the balance between funding ongoing projects for continued provision of services, but also funding for new services or new goods going into a particular local area. And so grant funding is always finite. So they will be thinking about what are we trying to achieve? Do we want to continue the provision of those services? Or actually, are there new services that we believe would add more value? And actually, that brings us nicely to the financial element. So be clear on your finances, have a budget, know how and where you'll spend the money and what value for money per beneficiary actually means. How will you measure that value for money? What will it cost? Who are the beneficiaries? What is the cost? And therefore the value per beneficiary. One of the things on the financials, though, the funders at the roadshow that I attended were really keen to get across as a message was that they were keen to reassure grant fundees that they know that things can change within a grant funding period. So if you are successful at getting grant funding, then communication remains as key following that funding as it is in communicating what you're trying to do in your funding application. So you won't necessarily be held to each exact pound going exactly where you said it would go, but you will be held to account for the outcomes that you said that the grant funding will achieve. If there are delays or issues or disruptions to those things, the advice from funding facilitators was communicate well, communicate early, talk about those delays, talk about any budgetary issues, really see your funding organisation as a partner. You have a shared goal. You both want to achieve the outcomes of this funding. So if there are any issues with that, chat as early as you can to your funder. And then, as with anything, make sure you don't forget anything. And this is super relevant as well with contracts. So if there are attachments that you want to put in there or crucial information, make sure that you attach them. Whilst you might be able to discuss the project with funding facilitators during the application process, ultimately, you will be judged on the application itself. And that will usually go to a panel. So they can only know, and it's exactly the same with a contract bid, they can only know what you tell them in that funding application, regardless of whatever cursory conversations you have on the periphery. So make sure that if you want your funder to know something, that you write it down. Missing information or assumptions that you make, and we'll talk about assumptions a little bit in contracts, will only hinder your chances at being successful. And then in terms of where do we find grants? So I've included a couple of things. So these are live links when you get it over to you. So you can go on, in the case of Durham and the Police and Crime Commissioner, you can go over to their website and you can download their plan. And in a link to their plan, there is a Word document. I will attach it to the slide deck and the video that comes out, which actually speaks to some of the funding, and specifically it talks about the funding amount that they get from the Ministry of Justice, for example, and it will give you some indications of what's important to the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, what funding they might have coming in, and then it will give you some idea of the things that they are looking to spend that on. And in the Police and Crime Plan, you will see that there are 6 safer priorities, and I've popped them on screen for us today. So Durham OPCC are looking at safer communities, safer business, safer countryside, safer online, safer people, and safer roads. And so if you're an organisation that can be a useful enabler to delivering safer communities, safer business, safer countryside, etc., then actually that could be a really positive link into working for the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner. Every OPCC, it's my understanding, will have a police and crime plan. So you should be able to, if you are wanting to work in a broader area than just Durham, for example, you should be able to access the current police and crime plan that will give you ideas around what is important and what the priorities are, and therefore where funding is likely to be allocated. If you, and it's in their commissioning strategy that you can see the funding information. If you want to look broader than one specific OPCC, for example, there is Grant Finder. I've put a live link into Grant Finder. It is a paid-for search engine. It isn't free of charge. The government do have a Grant Finder as well, which is free of charge. I'll pop the link to that in with the slide deck also that you can use. Grant Finder, I have subscribed to it. It is actually a pretty decent funding engine. I remember when I was doing the roadshow in Bradford that, and this is true of Bradford, but it may well be true in other areas, so it's worth checking. Some libraries were hosting Grant Finder so that local not-for-profit or VCSE social enterprise organisations could go into the library and use Grant Finder free of charge. So before you subscribe to it, it may well be worth checking out if it is offered through your local library, for example. But there are just a couple of ways that you can access information about funding and about grants specifically. Just check if we've got anything in the chat. We've not. So if I move on to public sector contracts from grants for a second. So it's worth actually just thinking about why would we want to, the grant funding application is often a simpler process than a public sector contract competition process might be. What we are seeing in public sector is There are things that have always been historically or traditionally on grants that are moving into commission services and are being competed via a public sector contract. So you might see, if you were grant funded before, and this isn't true of everywhere, but you might see some change that those things that were grants are now becoming public sector contracts. There was a mandate, and this is a pretty old mandate now, but it speaks to the commitment of the public sector to spend with smaller organisations and the voluntary sector. So a SME is a small and medium-sized enterprise. And actually, the public sector is all about delivering public good. So the terminology in the public sector is social value. We're going to talk about social value, but effectively, what it really means is, how can we make sure that we add as much value with every pound of taxpayers' money as possible? It's a big market, but it's also a fairly stable market. And I know that we've got the spending review coming up in the next 24 hours. So we'll see what happens in policing, and there may well be cuts to public funding. Regardless of those cuts, which will definitely put pressure on any contracting authority, actually, it is a fairly stable market, in excess of 300 billion per year, and the public sector buys everything. So victim services in the justice sector, lots of procurement around how to support victims of violence, how to prevent crime, etc., etc. All of that, and everything that goes into that, including keeping the lights on, the stationery, the water, the uniforms, etc., right the way down to some of that direct local victim support stuff as well. We are post-COVID now, but the ripple effect and the impact on societies, communities, and businesses of COVID remains with us. And so actually what we're thinking about is, how do we build resilience for the future? How do we make sure that we can grow our local economies and deliver the services that our communities, our families, and our residents really need? And in the police forces and police and crime commissioners, that's all going to be centred around the police and crime plan. But actually, what we're also thinking about in public sector is, how do we become accessible to all organisations, regardless of size, regardless of sector, and regardless of maturity, whether we're starting out for the first time or we're seeking to grow. And that speaks to that civic responsibility that anchor institutions, which police forces, police and crime commissioners, universities, local authorities, NHS trusts, they are anchor institutions. They're rooted in place. And so there's civic responsibilities to that local landscape, both economically but also socially as well. And all of that together, I think, means whilst it is not free of bureaucracy or challenge, it actually is a really good market to look at, because it can deliver real stability and growth potential to local organisations. So how do we find opportunities in the public sector? So we know that we are no longer a part of the European Economic Union, so we are post-Brexit. Our exit to the EU has happened, or the Economic Union. And so what that means is that we were previously governed by European procurement regulations, so the public contract regulations of 2015. We are now governed by the Procurement Act of 2023. The reality is that both sets of regulations are running concurrently. So the regulations changed on the 24th of February this year. So any procurements that were put out into the market before the 24th of February were governed by the the public contract regulations of 2015, PCR 15. And so dynamic purchasing systems, which are great for smaller organisations for under threshold opportunities, they are still open for businesses to find and to join, and they can be extended up to February 2029. So if you were already on a framework, for example, that was put out into the market pre-February 24th this year, then that framework will last until its natural end date. There will be no new procurements that are governed by the public contract regulations of 2015, only dynamic purchasing systems, which you can join right up until they expire, which could be as late as February 2029. I'm not talking through in any detail what a dynamic purchasing system is here today, but I would be happy to do that on a one-to-one basis, or I have got some webinars and video tutorials on what a DPS is, a dynamic purchasing system, and how to use them. So I'll also put a link to that in the slide deck and notes that come out. But essentially, a DPS is always open, so you can join it whenever you want. It has a fairly simplistic joining mechanism. And then when there is a demand for services, the businesses that are on the dynamic purchasing system receive a notification, and you can choose whether you want to bid for those particular services. But it's usually a fairly light touch process. And whilst it wasn't intended necessarily for under threshold opportunities, it's become a really popular tool for under threshold opportunities. So they're, for smaller organisations, they can be a really useful tool. Sadly, they don't exist under the Procurement Act 2023. So there is something called a dynamic market, but those opportunities are above threshold only. If anyone isn't familiar with the threshold for goods and services currently in the public sector, it's the January 2024 figure still applies, and including VAT, that threshold is 214,904. So if you are looking at opportunities where the specific contract would be above that value, or the whole of the DPS or dynamic market, for example, would be above that threshold, then you would see those opportunities coming out now. But if it's below that threshold, if any of those smaller competitions are below that threshold, then we can't use a dynamic market for it. So my understanding is, just for those that are interested, that the dynamic market is likely to go back through primary legislation to be able to be used under threshold, but that is probably in well in excess of a year before we get that. So what we have under the Procurement Act now is something called the Central Digital Platform. It is also the Finder Tender Service. They are the same thing. So anybody that you're talking to in the public sector might talk to you about Finder Tender Service or the Central Digital Platform, or both. They are one and the same. The Finder Tender Service has been around for a while, but what we've expanded, or the Cabinet Office have expanded the Finder Tender Service as of the 24th of February this year, is to include a supplier information system, so a supplier register, if you like. You can use the Finder Tender Service for any above threshold opportunities. That's where all above threshold opportunities will be published. All of the notices will be there to tell you about those opportunities. And you can search on the Finder Tender Service free of charge. If you want to interact with any of those opportunities, i.e. get the documents, have a look, and potentially even go on to bid, then you would need to be registered through the supplier information system on the Central Digital Platform, the Finder Tender Service. What I've done, I've included, it's a 20-minute video. It's a tutorial that takes you through the supplier information system and how to put your information in there. You can skip 2 different chapters, so you don't have to watch the whole of the 20 minutes, and you certainly don't have to watch it in one go, but it will take you through all of the core parts of that registration as a supplier. What you will get, you'll create a unique OneGov code, and you will also, through that registration, get what's called your share code, and you'll need both of those codes to be able to take part in any above threshold opportunities through the Finder Tender Service. What's useful about the expansion of Finder Tender is that when you enter your information into that supplier information system, we will always be actually bidding through the regular procurement portals. So in policing and in blue light commercial, for example, that's the Sell2 system that's powered by Intend. But what we have to do prior to the find a tender service was we would always have to enter that supplier information into every bid that we wanted to interact with. The supplier information system means that all that information that we put in there, it's pulled through automatically to the procurement portal of which every contracting authority will be using a procurement portal. There are different types. But that information we put in the supplier information system, we only have to do it once and it pulls through to our bids. And so hopefully that will save some duplication, repetition, and therefore some time for us as bidders. And time is, of course, the most precious commodity that we've all got. So it is hopefully a really useful tool. That is always, as I've said, above threshold opportunities, above that 214,904, but it is there trying to reduce some of that duplication that we see in public sector at the moment. So there are different places that you can find public sector opportunities. So I've added this in. So the Find a Tender service that I've just talked about, that central digital platform, you can find through this link here. For under threshold opportunities, the Cabinet Office have a search engine called Contracts Finder, and Contracts Finder will be hosting opportunities in central government above 10,000 plus VAT, and typically in wider public sector, anything above 25,000 plus VAT, so above 30,000 in total value. I generally, and it is entirely up to individuals, but I generally start with Contracts Finder because it should also show you above threshold opportunities. But those two, Contracts Finder and Find a Tender service, are both hosted by the government and they're both free of charge to use. So you can have a look at those and they will both point you to the relevant procurement portal that your contracting authority that you're looking at is using. So it will point you in the right place. Excuse me. In both cases, in Find a Tender and Contracts Finder, we have video tutorials of how to register for them, how to express interest in an opportunity, and how to set alerts up. So I'll send some of those things over as well with the slide deck and the video that comes out. If you're in one of the devolved administrations, so Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there are links specifically to contracts in those areas if you're interested in looking at them. And if you are potentially looking to work for central government departments, typically they'll be using the Bravo solution. So there's a link there to two search engines, the devolved administrations for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and then central government as well. So hopefully that's helpful for everyone. If we start to pull apart now the contracts process, so I've broken it down into 8 key elements that you can see on screen, and these are typically what's at play. So, and especially above threshold opportunities specifically. So you might see some pre-market engagement, a prior information notice, or a request for information, that kind of thing. Often the public sector will start talking to the marketplace before they're actually active in seeking bids in from the marketplace. They are likely to be advertised. We are encouraging public sector to advertise those things on social media, but they are likely to be advertised on those search engines that I talked about, the procurement portals that the contracting authority uses, and also potentially their own websites as well. So some places that you can go to look at to get to know about those pre-market engagement events. Ultimately, there'll be an advertisement of opportunity in some way, shape or form. So depending on the value, but certainly Above threshold, there has to be an advertisement of that opportunity. Below the threshold, there's something called contract procedure rules. And effectively what that means is every contracting authority below that threshold has to write down how they will proceed with their processes at what value. So most organizations will have, you'll find it on their website. At 50,000, this is what we do. At 25,000, this is what we do. At 10,000, this is what we do. And if they have written it down, they'll be obliged to act in accordance with those processes. And that will tell you how they might seek to advertise if they are seeking to advertise. And of course, below threshold, there is no legal requirement to advertise everything. There are some nuances in rules in there, but you should be able to find out what they plan to do at what value, so you understand the process. Above threshold, we'll be looking at an invitation to tender, an ITT, and in that document, it will have all of the important information. So your instructions to bidders are usually in your invitation to tender. The specification is usually in the invitation to tender. Your key dates, the scoring criteria, all of that kind of thing. So the invitation to tender is a really important document. At the front end of any public procurement, there'll be potentially a procurement specific questionnaire. There will be, if it's above threshold. Below threshold, there might be elements of the procurement specific questionnaire. That used to be called the standard selection questionnaire. Effectively, it is asking about you as an organisation. So who are you? Where are you? How big are you? What is your financial and economic standing? What's your competence, etc. You can see on screen that 4 of these are underlined in blue. They are live links to lunch and learn sessions, about 20 minutes long, that we do every March. So it's this March's sessions where we've done a deep dive into what is the procurement specific questionnaire. We run through it section by section. We've got a deep dive on specification, evaluation, criteria and weightings. We're doing a bit of that today. And the same on legal terms and conditions, although it's not legal advice, but it is practitioner guidance in terms of these are the types of terms and conditions that you probably want to be aware of. And then also we're bringing to life the feedback process. And how this navigates is once you've gone through whatever questionnaire there is at the front end, the procurement specific questionnaire, you'll be thinking about your quality, technical and pricing questions. And you'll be answering those as part of your bid submissions. You'll be signing up to the legal terms and conditions. And not in all cases, it's not a case in every public sector opportunity that there's always winners and losers, but often there are successful organisations and unsuccessful organisations. You should, in all cases, get some feedback. And we are always minded to encourage our public sector clients to, regardless of value, give sufficient enough detailed feedback so that if an organisation has been unsuccessful, they can understand why they've been unsuccessful and do something with that feedback. Above that threshold that we've talked about, you would get something called an assessment summary, which would have fairly detailed feedback in it. So we're going to drill down a little bit into more detail on this. So what's the specification? I don't want to teach everyone to suck eggs, but the specification is, it does what it says on the tin. It effectively is the document that the public sector use to tell you what they want to buy, but moreover, why they want to buy it, what's important, why and how will they measure some of those important things. It's the what, but also usually the why. And it's, in my view, it is one of the most important and crucial documents in any bid. Our advice would be one of the first jobs that you do if you're seeking to take part in a procurement tender is to read through the specification thoroughly. You can, when you're doing that, you can make a note of any questions that you might have in that clarification process. And I'll explain what the clarification process is in a second. You can also make a note of any evidence that you have of parts of that specification that you might be able to back up when you get to your quality or technical questions. You might also make a note of any gaps you have. So it could be a really useful document in deciding whether you do actually want to bid for this opportunity or not. The clarification process, the timings of it will be included in the invitation to tender, the instructions to bidders. Usually it's a time-sensitive process. So there'll usually be an end date of when you can ask clarification questions. And it does exactly, again, what it says on the tin. It is for bidders to be able to ask for points of clarity. So if there's something that you don't fully understand, you can use that clarification question process to do it. It's run through whatever portal it is that the contracting authority is using. So you would ask a question via the portal. And what the contracting authority will do is they will create a clarification log of all questions that are asked, and they will publish the answers to those questions to all bidders, unless there is some real sensitivity issues. But usually they would publish all answers to all bidders. So if you have a point of clarity, it can often be really useful to have a look at the clarification log first to see if someone else has already asked that question and it's been answered. That can often be the quickest route into getting an answer that you need. It's worth noting that when you're completing the quality or technical questions in any public sector bid, your answers to those questions need to relate back to the specification. If you think about it as a giant job interview in some ways, so you have your job description and your person spec. And in your job application letter, effectively what you're trying to say to the employer is, I have these job person spec things, I have these qualifications, I have these accreditations. That's what the procurement specific questionnaire is trying to test. And then you're also in your application letter trying to tell your employer, I can do or have done all of these things that you've listed in the job description. Here is the evidence of it. A procurement bid is really no different. We are in effect trying to show our evaluator, whoever is scoring the bid, the contracting authority, that we can deliver that specification. It's worth noting that the quality questions and technical questions are testing our ability to deliver what's needed. So you should only be questioned on what is in that specification. That's how important a document it is. If there are quality questions that don't relate to the specification, then actually that is grounds to flag that. It's something called undisclosed criteria. So everything that you're asked about in the quality and technical questions should be included in that specification. So you should be able to relate the two back to each other. And you'll have something called the evaluation criteria or scoring criteria. Every competitive process, regardless of value, should make it really clear how the work will be awarded. How will we get it? Even if that's in 3 quotes, how will my quote be the winning quote? If I'm in a bid, a tender situation, it will be via this evaluation, this scoring criteria. Usually it's a sliding scale. I've got an example of one to show you on the next slide. And usually it will have a weighting. So each question will have a percentage weighting. So if there is 100% of marks available and there are 4 questions, it could be that each question has a 25% weighting. But it could equally be that one question has a 50% weighting, one question has a 30% weighting, and 2 questions have a 10% weighting. And those weightings can be really helpful as bidders to show us how important that question is. So we know that we want to use the specification, we want to use the scoring criteria and those weightings to help us understand how we can optimize our best chance at scoring the best possible scores and therefore winning the bid. We might also have some constraints in there. We might have word counts or page counts, and I'll talk to you about those constraints in a second. So this is a sample of an evaluation criteria. It's a very common one. There might be slight variations to the theme, but generally speaking, there is a score, the description of that score, and then an explanation of that score. So they often rank 0 to 5, 0 to 10, 0 to 100, but there's usually only a handful of actual score terms. So to score a 0, to score an unacceptable score, in this particular example, it says failed to provide a response at all, or the response that was provided was wholly inconsistent with the requirements outlined in the question. On the flip side, an outstanding score, the best score that you can get, covers all the elements of the requirements outlined in the question, provides a high level of relevant and detailed information, backed up with clear evidence, and demonstrates a robust and coherent understanding, in this case, of the Council's requirements, with no issues, no weaknesses, and no omissions. And we can use that scoring criteria to sense check the answers that we write. Where do we think we are? Have we covered all the elements of the requirements in the question? Have we provided relevant and detailed information? Have we backed it up with clear evidence? What differentiates a 4 and a 5 is that high level of relevance and detailed information, that robust and coherent understanding of the requirements, no weaknesses, no omissions. Where would we put ourselves? We can almost do a sense check against the scoring criteria of where we think we are and how we think we've put that answer together. And the next 2 slides, I'm going to break that down even more. So I ran a workshop actually for some police forces and OPCCs yesterday, and we were talking about breaking questions down into the verb elements, the active parts of the question. I've got an actual example to show you on the next slide. So when we're looking at these quality and technical questions, what the first job we're going to do is read the question, and we're going to work out which parts of the question we need to answer. Because of course, in the evaluation criteria, we're needing to answer all of those elements if we're going to score anything above a 3. If we don't answer all of those elements, we could be poor, very poor, or even unacceptable, for example. So we need to identify what those elements of the questions are. We do that, excuse me, by seeking out the verb, the active parts of the questions. It probably makes complete common sense to when I say that we should only ever answer the question that we're asked. But despite 30 years in procurement and 12 years as a small business, working for the public sector, answering many bids as a bidder, but also setting bids as a contracting authority, I know firsthand actually how challenging that is. But we have to try and make sure that we only answer the question. So we have to be really strict and scrutinize our answers really well. Have I answered the question, but only the question that was asked? And if I have gone above and beyond with more information, can I make sure that it's relevant? Because I want to go above and beyond, but what I don't want to do is put superfluous information in there that isn't relevant to the question that's been asked. We also want to evidence answer as much as possible. So as an evaluator once, I was evaluating a question where a bidder said, "We are world class at eradicating modern slavery." And as a procurement professional, I thought, brilliant, this is going to be great. But that's where it ended. What the bidder didn't go on to do is say how they were world class in eradicating modern slavery, how they'd measured it to be able to make such a grand and bold statement. They actually just couldn't back that statement up at all. And so we should ask ourselves as bidders, how, why, so what? Why is that relevant? Have I said how I have done it or how I will do it going forward? Can I back up what I'm saying? And that might be the different methods of communication. We might have one-to-one workshops, we might have group workshops, we might have virtual catch-ups, we might have feedback loops. You can say all of those things, but then if you talk about how well they've worked, how many people have used them, or how you expect to split those up, so we will have group sessions 4 times a week, we will have one-to-one sessions for at least 30 people once a week. We're available on the telephone 24/7, etc., etc. You can always evidence those things and back them up with some real meat on the bones. You might be asked to provide documents. So you might be asked, for example, for something like an implementation plan. If you are asked to provide any specific documents, please make sure that you do, in fact, provide them and you don't forget them. Again, that sounds like so very obvious, but as a bidder, one of our final tasks is to sense check each question. What were we asked to provide? What did we say we were going to provide? And have we attached all of those things in our submission? And are they the up-to-date versions? The amount of documents that we see with track changes and comments still in them, make sure that you've checked, double-checked, they're clean. There will normally be a format that you can use, PDF or Word, for example. Make sure that you have adhered to those formats. There might be some constraints. So I've talked about this a couple of times. A word count, a page count, for example. If there is a word count, the word count will give you another clue about how important that question is. So if you are allowed a small word count, then that might tell you that that is because it is less important to others. The weighting is the clearer indication of that. If you've got 2,000 words available to you, that might tell you that that is a really important question. If you feel that there is a mismatch between the weighting and the word count, you can always ask a clarification question on it. So one of the examples we chatted through in a workshop yesterday was a 50% weighting with 200 words probably doesn't feel like it matches. It's so important. We probably need more words, and especially if it's a big and meaty question. So you can ask questions around that stuff. But whatever the word count is, don't exceed it. You don't need to repeat the question before you answer it. If you are ticking off all of the doing elements, you'll probably find that you're using most, if not all, of the word count that's available to you. If there's a page count, 2 pages of A4, for example, there will normally be a font size that's specified. If there isn't, it is worth checking on clarification, because for fairness, normally if there's 2 pages of A4, for example, you'll be stipulated font size, something like Arial font size 11. And that's to make sure that everyone has a fair and equitable opportunity of how they use those constraints. So let's have a look at this as a practical example. Answering quality questions. So these are 3, they're very real questions from a local authority in Yorkshire, a real bid that went out. So first question, I have highlighted in yellow, and I'm just going to run through the first question. I've highlighted in yellow what the active parts of the question are, what the doing elements of that question are. So how to ensure care plans are individually tailored, person-centred, and meet the needs and outcomes of the person. We're asked then within the answer to state how we ensure that care plans are kept up to date, what measures we have in place to ensure people are involved in their care planning, and how we link with partners to ensure that needs are met. By my count, that's 6 verb elements of the question, 6 active parts of the question. So 6 things that we want to tick off in our answer. And we've got 600 words, no attachments are allowed, and that question is weighted at 25%. So we know of the 3 questions that are on screen, at least, that that's the highest weighted question with the most words available to it. So we know that that is where we want to get our biggest score, because it will have the most impact. So when we've written our 600 words, we can go back through it and we can double check. Have we talked about how care plans are individually tailored? Have we talked about they're person-centred? Have we talked about how we meet the needs and outcomes of the person? Have we backed those things up with evidence? Have we talked about how we keep our care plans up to date and those measures that are in place to ensure that people are involved in their own care planning? And have we talked about how we link with partners to ensure that needs are met? We can tick, 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 and we can tick off both that we've addressed it, but also that we've evidenced it. And it can be a really useful methodical, I can't say it, I'm so sorry, methodical way of going through the question. Thank you. I know some people have had to drop off for another session. That's absolutely fine. It is all coming out to you, so that's not a problem. But hopefully using that methodical approach will help you sense check, have I included what I need to include, and have I backed that up with evidence? And if I check that back with the specification. Am I pulling the specification in? So am I reflecting the specification into my answer? And am I answering the scoring criteria in the way that it needs to be answered? So quite quickly on social value and carbon net zero, the next couple of slides. So social value is driven by something called the Public Services Act of 2012. It was assented to law in January 2013. It's often called the Social Value Act. Its physical name is the Public Services Act. Basically, it is reinforcing the message that procurement is not just about lowest price, and that actually in procurement we need to take a broad view of value for money. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. In essence, there is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. And what that does is provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and planet, both now and into the future. At the heart of that are these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They are an urgent call for action by all countries, both developing and developed, in a global partnership. And they are all about recognising that ending poverty and other deprivations have to go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality and spur economic growth, all whilst tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. They can often be a really useful tool for thinking about what's important to you as a provider to the public sector. So you might be thinking about how you are creating new jobs, new skills, how you are empowering your workforce, how you're developing skills, how you're helping vulnerable groups or underrepresented groups in society to engage in jobs and skills. You might be thinking about how you're tackling climate change, how you're using your waste, what you're doing with your energy. You might be thinking about who you buy from, your supplier diversity, how you might engage innovation or resilience, and all of those things. There is something called the National Procurement Policy Statement. And in there, you can get a real flavour of what's important to public sector procurement. And it reflects mission-driven government. One of the things that I saw in mission-driven government, and regardless of personal political views of parties, in there is real focus on supporting and being accessible to smaller organisations, sole traders, micro businesses, and supporting civic society organisations, not-for-profits, social enterprises, etc. So, there is a real drive under this social value heading to support supplier diversity, to support inclusion in supplier bases. And for the public sector, there is a positive duty to have regard to the challenges and barriers that smaller organisations might face, but also to think about what the practicable solutions that might be available to public sector organisations to remove those barriers. So, for example, in a bid, you might need to have a specific accreditation or a specific type of insurance, but you shouldn't be asked for those things to be in place at point of bid. You should be asked to have them in place for either the contract start date or a point in time thereafter. And that's to make sure that those things in and of themselves don't exclude parts of the marketplace. So those are some very typical constructs that you might see. But any volunteering that your organisation does, in the voluntary sector, it can be a little confusing because often voluntary sector organisations, and especially in social care and the justice sector, the very core element of what you do is delivering social impact. When you're asked about social value in a bid situation, typically it's asking for things outside of the core contract subject matter. So if the contract is for counselling services for victims of sexual violence, and that's what your charity or social enterprise or business delivers, if you're asked about social value in that bid, it will be in addition to that. So that might be, what are you doing to upskill your counsellors? What are you doing in the voluntary sector? How do you support underrepresented groups? If you win this contract, will you employ, create new jobs? Will you retain jobs? Will you be able to put more skills development in place? That kind of thing. Usually it's in addition to the core subject matter of the contract, but also in addition, if you win that contract, in addition to what you're already doing. Usually those things are at play, that additionality agenda. If you are working on social value in any sort of, whether it's a grant funding or a commission service bid, and you want to have a chat about social value specifically, do give me a shout. And it actually falls under the social value heading, but it's worth pulling out carbon net zero as a separate agenda almost. Net zero is a real hot topic for government at the minute. Put simply, net zero means cutting carbon emissions to a small amount of residual emissions that can be absorbed and durably stored by nature and other carbon dioxide removals, leaving zero in the atmosphere. And our government is aiming for net zero by 2050. And again, it can be a very polarizing topic, but what the science is showing at the minute is that in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change and preserve, therefore, a livable planet, global temperature increases need to be limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Currently, we're about 1.1 degrees warmer than it was in the late 1800s. So this is all centered around the Paris Agreement. So emissions need to be cut by 45% by 2030, and we need to reach net zero by 2050 in order to be able to achieve it. It's fair to say it's probably one of the greatest challenges that humankind has faced. And it's probably equally as fair to say it calls for nothing less than a complete transformation of how we produce, how we consume, and how we move about. Our viewpoint in Go for Growth is that it will take every business and every individual to make some contribution in order to get there. And what we're seeing in public sector is that whilst the legislation says at the minute contracts of above 5 million must have a carbon reduction plan, what we're seeing in the public sector is two things. Lots more requirements to have a carbon reduction plan, regardless of the value of the opportunity. And also that individual contracting authorities' aspirations on net zero can differ from the government's. So you might want to work for a police force who has declared climate emergency and who is aiming for net zero by 2030 or 2040 or something other than 2050. And you might be working for different entities who have different aspirations on the same topic, which can be challenging. So the advice is, if you haven't started to think about your carbon reduction plan, your journey of how you might, in a proportionate and relevant to your organisation, how you might start moving towards net zero, now is probably the time to start thinking about it. And I said with social value, and I mean it also with carbon net zero, if that's something you would like to have a chat with Go for Growth about, then please do give me a shout. Final couple of things, and then I'll open up for questions. So some common pitfalls in bids. We've covered a lot of this already. So the couple of things that I'm going to pull out in here are, there's three things I'm going to pull out: caveating, reusing previous bids, and assumptions. So in caveating, what I mean by that is if you haven't specifically been asked to provide answers in certain scenarios and different scenarios, if you have to caveat anything in your bid submission, there's probably a clarification question that needs asking. So if we do X, Y, Z, it will cost ABC. If we do ABC, it will cost X, Y, Z. They're really difficult for evaluators to score. So unless you've been asked to do it that way, our advice would be avoid putting any caveats in. And if you feel like you need to caveat, then try and ask a clarification question if you can. I, as a procurer and as a bidder, I'm a great believer in reusing information that we've got wherever that is appropriate to do so. What public procurers tell me really often is that bidders can often fall foul of not checking that information and leaving stray references to previous bids in their previous clients, references that don't make sense to this bid. So again, I am very pro being as efficient and as effective as possible. And if reusing a previous bid information will make that process for you more effective or efficient, go right ahead. But it comes with those health warnings of you must check that it's relevant, that it's reflective of the questions that you're being asked, and that it doesn't contain any information that shouldn't be there. And then the final thing just to pull out here is assumptions. Both in grants and tenders, you will only be judged on what's written down. So don't assume, even if you're an incumbent, even if you've been grant funded before, even if you have a great relationship with that contracting authority, regardless of the funding mechanism, don't assume that they can bring that, any prior knowledge they may have, into the scoring process. It is illegal under the regulations. You can't do that. And in a grant funding situation, it has to be fair and equitable. Those are the principles that enshrine anything to do with public sector. So if you want your grant funding facilitator or your bid evaluator to know something, then write it down. Don't assume that, oh, well, they know we do that, so we don't need to add that in. If you want them to know it in the context of the bid or the grant, you must write it down in your application. And then some final key messages. These, well, a lot of them will sound fairly obvious. Read all the documents really carefully, make a note of those key dates, ask any questions you might have as early as possible through that clarification process. If it's a competitive tender and not a dynamic purchasing system or a dynamic market or an open framework or an approved provider list or something that is always open, it means that there's only one opportunity to take part. It won't reopen and there won't be other rounds of applications. So in lots of cases, we have one bite of the cherry. We have one opportunity to put our best foot forward in either a competitive tender or a grant funding application. So it's worth trying to carve out the right amount of time to be able to focus on it if it's something that is important to your organisation. In both cases, less so in grant funding, actually. In fact, I'm not sure it would ever apply in grant funding. I'm sure there might be cases, but definitely in procurements, TUPE might apply. And the TUPE is the transfer of undertakings and protection of employment legislation. So if you win a contract for services, for example, from another organisation, there may be people in that organisation that would transfer across to your organisation. It is a complicated piece of legislation. It can have big financial implications for your organisation on things like pension strain, terms and conditions of employment will be different. So if TUPE is at play, our advice would be try and understand the implications of it. If you're members of Clinks potentially, or Federation of Small Businesses, or Chambers especially, the latter two especially, you will have access to free legal advice in there as part of your membership. So you can go and get some advice on TUPE, but it's definitely one to keep an eye out for. And usually if TUPE is at play, you might have to sign a confidentiality agreement to obtain the relevant information. Do that as early as you possibly can, because it will be really meaningful potentially to your bid. Have you uploaded everything? And then check, double check and triple check before submission that you are happy with everything that you're submitting. There's often a big conversation about external support. There are bid writers, there are bid reviewers. You can pay people to write the bid for you. You can pay people, organisations, to review your bid for you and give you some feedback. You can also use technology. And there is a big debate on, excuse me, I've got a real frog in my throat, on artificial intelligence. So things like ChatGPT, Claude, Manus, other platforms. There is a procurement policy note of February 24 that came out that some contracting authorities might ask you to declare if you have used AI in your bid, and if so, how you have used it. If they're asking about AI, in my view, they should also be asking you if you've had any kind of external support. there is nothing wrong with using any of those tools. You can pay for AI, you can use free versions of AI. You will definitely pay for formal bid writing and bid review services. They can be really helpful, but the message is, regardless of what support you may or may not use, your bid is yours. If you win it, you'll be contractually obliged to deliver it. So don't let anybody overpromise on your behalf. Make sure that the information that you submit is genuine and it hasn't been, you're not falling foul of copyright or intellectual property anywhere. If you've hoofed anything off the internet, make sure that it is a fair and accurate reflection of how you work and how you will work if you win that contract. Because regardless of what support you have, it will be your organisation that's legally obliged to deliver when you get there. And what we can't say is, oh, AI did it, or the external bid writer did it, and therefore we're not culpable. We are. Whoever the legal entity is that the contract is with will be held to account. So those tools are really useful. I'm actually a habitual user of AI tools, both in procurement and as a bidder. But they definitely come with those health warnings, and they are serious health warnings from a governance perspective, as well as from an accuracy and ultimately a fair reflection of how you work. So have a think about those things as well. Go for Growth is here to help. If we can be of any help, please get in touch. That's my mobile number that's on there and our support email address. We're actually helping in excess of 20,000 businesses now. There's over 200 resources in our membership resources on our website. They are all free of charge to access. There's a short registration form. We don't use that to spam you. You can opt to join our newsletter, and only then will we write to you. There is a QR code on the next screen. But just filling out that registration form doesn't automatically mean that we will write to you. What we use that for is to understand what resources are useful for what businesses in what area. And then we use that to help us develop the right support. So please do feel free to use Go for Growth as much as you would like. We have an open calendar, so you can book directly into certainly my calendar or my colleague's calendar for a 30 minutes Teams session. And there is no constraint on that. You can have as many as you like, and we can talk about whatever you like. And if we can't help you, we will certainly try and signpost you to someone that can. If you do want to get regular updates from Go for Growth, you can sign up to our newsletter. We don't spam. We send out a newsletter once a month, which should have helpful and valuable information in there if you are seeking to work for the public sector. And of course, under GDPR, you have the right to opt out at any time, and we won't sign you up without your agreement. So we certainly take writing to you really seriously. That is it from me. I hope that has been useful. We have time for some questions, so I will stop sharing and just see if we've got anything in the Q&A. We haven't as it stands at the moment. If you do have any questions, please feel free. I'll just check if there's anything in the chat. There isn't as it stands at the moment. If you've got any questions outside of this session, please do feel free to get in touch using those contact details. The slide deck and the recording will be out to you before the end of this week, so you should have them all, and I will include those extra bits and pieces as well when I send the slides out that I talked about. So hopefully that was useful. If we can be of any further help in the future, either with police and crime commissioners, police forces, or the wider public sector, please do get in touch. And that was a long session, so thank you for bearing with me. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day. Have a lovely rest of your Tuesday, and hopefully I will speak to you really soon. Thank you ever so much.